In the summer of 1938, Winston Churchill could not pay his bills. His bank account was overdrawn. His tax returns were delinquent. His country estate at Chartwell was mortgaged beyond its market value. His gambling losses at Monte Carlo and his catastrophic stock market positions had consumed 2 separate family inheritances. He had borrowed from his publisher against books he had not yet written. He owed money to his wine merchant, his cigar merchant, his architect, and his tailor simultaneously. The man who would become the most celebrated wartime leader in British history was within weeks of financial collapse, so complete that he had quietly begun planning to sell Chartwell and abandon the political career that required him to maintain it. A private rescue came in time. A group of wealthy supporters quietly paid his most urgent debts. Chartwell was saved. His political career continued. 7 years later, in 1945, Winston Churchill left Downing Street after losing the general election to Clement Attlee. He left with the equivalent of £4 million in his bank account. In today's terms, that is approximately £180 million. The man who entered the war nearly bankrupt emerged from it, one of the wealthiest private individuals in Britain. The Standard account treats this as the natural reward of literary genius. He wrote his war memoirs. They sold well. He was a great man who deserved his fortune, but the Inland Revenue files tell a different story. Those files were classified until 2004. One of them remains closed until 2040. And what the documents that have been released actually show is a financial operation considerably more sophisticated than writing a successful book. This is the documented story of how that operation worked, who designed it, what mechanisms it used, and why the institutions that approved it would prefer the details stayed in the files marked closed. To understand how Churchill ended the war with £4 million, you first need to understand precisely how he entered it with nothing. Because the financial desperation of 1938 was not a temporary setback, it was the culmination of 3 decades of systematic financial self-destruction, conducted at a scale that most men never approach. Churchill had inherited money twice. The first came from his father's estate. The second came from a distant American relative in the 1920s. Both were gone within years of receiving them. He spent the first maintaining a political career that required the performance of aristocratic wealth he did not possess. He spent the second on Chartwell, the Kent country house he purchased in 1922 and renovated so extensively that the costs exceeded every estimate by multiples that made his architect and contractors threaten legal action simultaneously. By 1927, the house and its furnishings alone had consumed £40,000. His architect, Philip Tilden, had not been paid in full. The renovation bills continued arriving years after the work was completed. Churchill's solution to chronic financial shortfall was to write. He was a genuinely gifted writer, and his books sold well enough that in good years his income from journalism and publishing exceeded £75,000 annually, a sum that would today represent several million pounds. But his spending consistently exceeded even this extraordinary income. The cigars, 4 a day minimum, a promise to cut back that was never kept. The champagne, a standing household rule that no more champagne should be bought, was announced in 1926 and quietly abandoned by 1927. The gambling at Monte Carlo, which Churchill pursued with the same boldness he brought to military campaigns and with equally catastrophic results. The share trading, conducted on the thinnest of margins based on tips from wealthy friends, which turned into a series of losses culminating in the 1929 Wall Street crash that wiped out the remainder of his American stock portfolio. Churchill's financial situation was further complicated by the nature of his income stream. A man who earns £75,000 in a good year but spends £100,000 in that same year does not become gradually poorer. He becomes catastrophically poorer at the precise moment when a bad year coincides with a debt cycle. By the mid-1930s, Churchill was experiencing both simultaneously. The stock market recovery after 1929 had restored some of his American portfolio value. Then in 1937 and 1938, the markets fell sharply again. Churchill's concentrated stock positions, he invested on margin, borrowing money to buy shares, meant that falling prices triggered margin calls that required immediate cash he did not have. His journalism income, which had been running at extraordinary levels in the early 1930s when he was producing a stream of newspaper articles and serialized books, had collapsed by 1938 because his anti-appeasement political campaign left no time to write for money. He was also fired by the Evening Standard in 1938. Lord Beaverbrook's paper terminating his column at the worst possible financial moment. When 1938 arrived, Churchill was simultaneously unable to meet his tax obligations and arrears on household bills, and facing a margin call from his American stockbroker for £18,000, equivalent to approximately £750,000 today. at precisely the moment when his investments had collapsed in value and his journalism income had dried up because his political commitments left no time to write for money. On the 2nd of April 1938, Chartwell was placed on the market. Churchill had concluded that selling the house was the only way to address debts that had accumulated beyond his ability to service. He was 63 years old. He wrote to Clementine that their children were almost all grown, and his life was probably in its closing decade. It was the letter of a man who had given up. He did not sell. Because 4 days later the house was quietly withdrawn from sale, a rescue had been arranged. Brendan Bracken, Churchill's parliamentary private secretary and one of the most strategically minded political operatives of his era, had arranged for a meeting between Churchill and Sir Henry Strakosch, an Austrian-born British banker mining magnate, and co-owner of The Economist, who had been supplying Churchill with confidential German arms statistics for several years. Strakosch offered to take over Churchill's collapsing Wall Street holdings at the price Churchill had originally paid for them, absorbing the loss personally, and to hold them for 3 years while paying Churchill £800 a year in interest. He also covered Churchill's immediate tax and debt obligations totaling £18,000. Churchill's response was a handwritten note, "I shall never forget this inestimable service." The arrangement was structured as a loan. Strakosch died in October 1943 without calling it in. In his will, he converted it to a gift, alongside similar loans he had made to other individuals. Churchill received a further £5,000 from Strakosch in June 1940, days after becoming Prime Minister, when Germany had already invaded France and the Low Countries, and Churchill was simultaneously directing Britain's military response and unable to cover his monthly household bills and tax obligations. Let that detail land for a moment. On the day Churchill told Parliament that Britain would fight on the beaches, one of the most celebrated speeches in the English language, he was personally insolvent. The man saving Western civilization could not pay his grocer. If you have not subscribed to the channel yet, please do it now. This is exactly the kind of financial history we cover, the documented mechanisms behind the events that shaped the modern world. Every subscriber genuinely matters to what we are building here. Now hold that picture. A prime minister personally insolvent in May 1940, dependent on the generosity of a private banker to cover his household bills while directing Britain's war effort. A man who had destroyed 2 inheritances, gambled away his American portfolio, and watched his journalism income collapse at the precise moment history required everything of him. Because what happened between that moment and the £4 million in 1945 is the part of the Churchill story that the authorized biography summarizes in a paragraph and moves past quickly. It is the part that required Inland Revenue files to be classified. And it is the part that, when you read what those files actually contain, tells you considerably more about how extraordinary wealth is actually built than any authorized account of literary genius. When Churchill became Prime Minister in May 1940, his official salary was £10,000 per annum. At the 90% wartime income tax rate that left him with £1,000, the interest on his existing debts consumed more than £1,000 per year. His official salary, therefore, left him with a net income of less than zero after servicing debts he had accumulated before the war began. Churchill did not live like a man with a net income of less than zero. He maintained Chartwell as a working estate. He employed domestic staff. He consumed champagne and cigars at a rate that his biographer David Luff later described as staggering given his financial position. The gap between Churchill's lifestyle and his official income was bridged in ways that the Inland Revenue files document with remarkable specificity. The first mechanism was the sale of film rights. Throughout the war years, Churchill sold the film rights to several of his pre-war books, his biography of the Duke of Marlborough, and other historical works. The Inland Revenue agreed that these proceeds should be classified not as income subject to the 90% wartime tax rate, but as capital receipts, a different and far less heavily taxed category. The legal basis for this distinction was debatable. The Revenue agreed to it anyway. Films were sometimes optioned and never made. The rights fees were paid. The tax treatment stood. The second mechanism involved Churchill's paintings and speeches. Churchill was a prolific amateur painter, and the reproduction rights to his paintings were potentially valuable. His wartime speeches were historic documents, whose reproduction rights were worth substantial sums to publishers. The Revenue agreed that proceeds from these rights should similarly be treated as untaxed capital receipts rather than income. A sitting prime minister was receiving tax-free payments for the reproduction of his official wartime speeches at the same time as delivering those speeches. The Revenue's files record this arrangement without apparent discomfort. The third mechanism was more complex and more consequential. Churchill's pre-war books had continued to earn royalties throughout the war years. Under his existing arrangement with the revenue, these royalties were protected from the 90% wartime income tax rate by a special status as a retired author, a classification Churchill had originally secured in the 1930s. Maintaining this status required that he not undertake new authorship during the war. Churchill was careful to maintain the distinction. While directing the war effort, he did not formally commit to new writing contracts. The retired author status held. The pre-war royalties accumulated under a favored tax treatment throughout the conflict. By the end of the war, the combination of these three mechanisms, film rights classified as capital reproduction rights classified as capital, and pre-war royalties protected by retired author status, had allowed Churchill to accumulate significant financial reserves despite an official salary that after 90% tax left him technically unable to service his debts. He had conducted this financial operation simultaneously with running the most consequential military alliance in British history. His financial advisors communicated with him about tax structuring, while he communicated with Roosevelt about strategy. Both sets of correspondence survive in the archives. There is a fourth element that the standard account almost never examines. When Churchill's friend Lord Camrose, proprietor of the Daily Telegraph, purchased Chartwell from the Churchills in 1946 for £43,500 and then arranged for the National Trust to take the property as a gift on condition that Churchill could live there. Rent-free for the remainder of his life, this was not simply private generosity between old friends. It was a carefully structured financial arrangement that simultaneously converted Churchill's most expensive liability into a tax-efficient asset. Churchill received the sale proceeds. He retained lifetime occupation. The maintenance costs transferred to the National Trust. In a single transaction, the house that had been consuming his fortune since 1922 became financially beneficial. Lord Camrose absorbed the cost. Churchill retained the benefit. The £43,500 Churchill received represented a significant addition to his post-war financial position on top of the wartime mechanisms already described. It was also another example of the recurring pattern in Churchill's financial life, the intervention of wealthy supporters at precisely the moment when his personal finances required rescue. The wartime mechanisms were preparatory. The main event came in November 1945, 4 months after Churchill left Downing Street. The day Churchill resigned as Prime Minister on the 26th of July 1945, he received the first offer for his war memoirs. The syndication rights alone, newspapers paying for the right to serialize extracts, were worth enormous sums. Multiple American publishers were competing for the book rights. The 6 volumes of the Second World War would become one of the most commercially successful works of history ever published, selling over 300,000 copies of each volume, translated into 18 languages, and earning Churchill a world record advance. Churchill initially declined the offers, not because he was not interested in writing the memoirs, but because accepting them would destroy a specific and very valuable tax arrangement. As a retired author, his pre-war book royalties had been protected throughout the war. Accepting a new writing commission would end his retired author status and expose all his accumulated wartime income to the 90% post-war income tax rate. The tax cost of accepting the first memoir offer on conventional terms would have consumed the overwhelming majority of the proceeds. The solution came from an unexpected direction. Marshall Field III, publisher of the Chicago Sun, suggested in November 1945 that Churchill should donate his private papers to a family trust. The logic was straightforward, but the implications were remarkable. If Churchill's papers, the correspondence, the memoranda, the draft documents, the private letters that constituted the raw material of the memoirs, were owned by a family trust rather than by Churchill personally, then Churchill's relationship to the memoirs would change fundamentally. He would not be the author selling the product of his labor. He would be the editor of documents owned by a trust. And the tax treatment of editorial fees was categorically different from the tax treatment of authorship income. By February 1946, Churchill's tax advisors had drawn up a detailed plan. Churchill donated his papers accumulated before July 1945, representing the entire wartime archive, to the Chartwell Literary Trust. The trust was a family trust whose beneficiaries were his children. Churchill would receive fees as editor of the memoirs produced from the trust documents. Those fees would be taxed at the ordinary income tax rate on editorial work rather than the punishing rates that would have applied to authorship income. 2/3 of the memoir proceeds were effectively sheltered from the tax rate that Churchill's own wartime government had imposed. The Inland Revenue examined this arrangement. They approved it. A senior official later described it in internal correspondence as a remarkably ingenious piece of tax planning. The files documenting this approval were classified and remained unavailable to researchers for decades. The arrangement was not illegal. It was also not what most people would consider the natural behavior of a patriotic war leader whose government had imposed 90% income tax on the British population as a wartime necessity. The memoir proceeds were then negotiated in New York by Emery Reeves, Churchill's literary agent, who secured $1.4 million from American publishers and £555,000 from British publishers for the rights to the 6 volumes. These were world record figures. The Chartwell trust structure meant that the majority of these proceeds reached Churchill's family at a fraction of the tax rate that would have applied to an ordinary British citizen earning the same income. This is the kind of documented financial history that the standard account almost never tells you directly. If this channel is new to you, please subscribe now, because we cover the paper trail behind the official version of events, so we now have the complete picture of the mechanism. A wartime income sheltered through capital reclassification of film rights, painting rights, and speech rights. A post-war memoir fortune sheltered through a family trust structure specifically designed to reclassify authorship income as editorial fees. 2 inland revenue files, one classified until 2004. One still closed until 2040, recording the government's approval of arrangements that allowed Britain's wartime prime minister to accumulate one of the largest private fortunes in post-war Britain at a fraction of the tax rate his own wartime government imposed on everyone else. The question the paper trail now forces us to ask is not whether Churchill deserved to be wealthy. The question is how the machinery actually worked, and who else knew about it. The Second World War, Churchill's 6-volume memoir of the conflict, was presented to the public as the personal testimony of the man who had led Britain through its most dangerous hour. It was serialized in newspapers across the world. It won Churchill the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1953, not for his wartime leadership, but explicitly for his literary output. It remains in print today. It made Churchill one of the most financially successful authors of the 20th century. It was also not entirely written by Winston Churchill. This is not a controversial claim. It is documented in the archives and acknowledged by Churchill's own literary assistants. Churchill himself said of the memoirs, "This is not history. This is my case." What he meant was that the volumes were constructed as advocacy, his account, his perspective, his defense of his decisions, rather than as objective history. What the archives additionally show is that the construction of this advocacy was a collaborative enterprise involving a team of researchers, drafters, and editors whose contribution to the final text was substantial. The barrister Dennis Kelly served as senior literary assistant and effectively as a principal writer on multiple volumes. Kelly condensed other historians' work, drafted chapters, and prepared material that Churchill then reviewed, annotated, and approved in his characteristic style. Lieutenant General Sir Henry Pownall, a former military officer, drafted significant sections of the military operational history. Bill Deacon, Churchill's pre-war research assistant, contributed extensively to the early volumes. By Churchill's own admission to his publishers, certain chapters of the later volumes had not been written by him at all. The U.S. publishers noted in internal correspondence that only approximately a quarter of the text in some volumes represented original Churchill writing. The remainder was assembled, drafted, and shaped by the syndicate of assistants working under his editorial direction. The Chartwell trust arrangement had anticipated and indeed structured this reality. Because Churchill was technically the editor of documents owned by the trust rather than the author of new work, the collaborative nature of the production was not merely a logistical convenience. It was embedded in the legal and tax architecture of the entire enterprise. Churchill was paid editorial fees. His assistants were paid from those fees. The trust received the underlying publishing income. The Inland Revenue collected tax on editorial fees at a rate designed for individual editorial work, rather than at the rates that would have applied to the world's most commercially successful post-war publishing operation. The memoirs also drew heavily on official government documents that were still classified at the time of writing. Churchill had privileged access to wartime cabinet papers, military telegrams, and diplomatic correspondence that no other author could have obtained. The cabinet secretary vetted the volumes before publication, not to prevent disclosure but to manage it. Churchill was given access to the official record of the war he had led in order to write the memoir of that war in terms that reflected his own account of events. The tension between Churchill's access to classified material and his commercial exploitation of that material in a tax-advantaged trust structure was noted by some contemporaries. It did not produce any official objection. By the time the 6 volumes were complete, Churchill had been awarded the Nobel Prize, had returned to Downing Street for a second term as Prime Minister, and had become the most famous living Briton in the world. The memoir proceeds, flowing through the Chartwell trust structure. Sheltered from the tax rates that applied to ordinary British earners generated by a production process that was collaborative in ways the public was not informed about, had helped transform the insolvent former Prime Minister of 1945 into a man of substantial independent wealth. The Nobel Prize itself deserves a moment of attention in this context. Churchill was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1953, not for his wartime speeches or his political leadership, but specifically for his historical writing, principally the war memoirs. The prize committee cited his mastery of historical description and his brilliant oratory in defending exalted human values. What the committee did not have access to, what the classified Inland Revenue files and the Chartwell archive documents were not yet available to show, was the extent to which the historical writing that won the prize had been produced by a team of assistants working within a tax structure, specifically designed to reclassify the proceeds from authorship income to editorial fees. Churchill accepted the prize with characteristic grace and characteristic silence about the machinery that had produced the work being honored. The 175,000 Swedish kroner prize money was a modest addition to a fortune already substantially built. The National Archives in Kew hold 2 thick Inland Revenue files documenting the revenue's dealings with Winston Churchill. The first was opened only in 2004, nearly 40 years after Churchill's death. The second remains closed until 2040. The file opened in 2004 documents the revenue's approval of Churchill's wartime capital treatment arrangements, the film rights, the painting reproduction rights, the speech rights classified as untaxed capital rather than income. It documents the internal revenue correspondence discussing the legitimacy of these arrangements. It records the conclusion that the arrangements were acceptable. The revenue officials who approved them appear to have understood exactly what they were approving. The file does not record any discomfort with the fact that a sitting wartime prime minister was receiving tax-free income for the reproduction of his official speeches while his government was imposing 90% income tax on ordinary British wage earners. The file that remains closed until 2040 presumably documents the Chartwell Trust arrangements, the memoir proceeds, the editorial fee structure, the 2/3 shelter from income tax on the World Record Publishing advance. The decision to keep this file closed for nearly a century after the events it documents is itself a form of evidence. Governments do not classify files whose contents would embarrass nobody for 75 years as a matter of routine. The standard classification period for sensitive personal financial arrangements is 30 years. The additional 45 years beyond the standard period communicates something about what the file contains. What the paper trail that is available already shows is this. Winston Churchill entered the war personally insolvent, saved from bankruptcy by the private generosity of a banker who converted his loan to a gift upon death. He served as Prime Minister of Britain at 90% income tax, while simultaneously arranging that his own wartime income should be classified as untaxed capital through a series of revenue-approved reclassifications. He then structured his post-war memoir fortune through a family trust arrangement specifically designed to shelter 2/3 of the proceeds from the tax rate his own wartime government had imposed. He produced those memoirs with substantial assistance from a team of researchers and drafters whose contribution was not publicly acknowledged, and he negotiated the sale of those memoirs using privileged access to classified government documents that no private citizen could have obtained. None of this was illegal. The revenue approved every arrangement. Churchill's advisors were operating within the law as it existed and as the revenue chose to interpret it. Churchill was not the only wealthy individual to use sophisticated trust structures and capital reclassification to minimize his tax exposure in the post-war period. He was perhaps the most notable, and he was certainly the only one whose government had imposed the tax rates he was working to avoid. The authorized biography of Winston Churchill runs to 8 volumes covering 8 million words. The financial mechanisms documented in this video occupy a handful of pages across those 8 volumes. The Inland Revenue files that document them were classified for decades. One remains closed until 2040. The 4 million pounds that answered the question your viewer asked in the comments of our Churchill video was not simply the reward of literary genius. It was the product of a financial operation of considerable sophistication, conducted simultaneously with saving Western civilization, by a man who understood that the mechanics of money were as consequential as the mechanics of war. The Chartwell Trust documents are in the National Archives. The Inland Revenue files that have been released are available to researchers. David Luff's No More Champagne, the most thorough examination of Churchill's finances, is in print. The History Today article on Churchill and the Taxman draws directly on the revenue's internal correspondence. The paper trail is open, and it tells a story about the relationship between public service, private wealth, and the tax structures that mediate between them that the official account has been summarizing rather than examining for over half a century. There is a question that the paper trail does not fully answer, whether Churchill's financial advisors and the inland revenue officials who approved their arrangements were operating purely within the existing law as sophisticated professionals routinely do, or whether the specific identity of their client influenced the revenue's willingness to approve arrangements it might have challenged if presented by a less celebrated figure. The revenue files available do not show the internal deliberations clearly enough to answer this question definitively. The file closed until 2040 presumably contains more of those deliberations. In 20 years, researchers will be able to read what the revenue officials actually said to each other about the Prime Minister's tax arrangements. Until then, the question remains open. What is not open is the basic factual record of what happened. Churchill entered the war insolvent. He left it wealthy. The mechanisms that produce that transformation are in the documents. The documents are in the archives. And the archives, unlike the authorized biography, do not summarize. If this is the kind of forensic financial history you have been looking for, please subscribe to the channel. And if this video changed how you think about a man you thought you already understood, share it with someone who still believes the £4 million was simply the reward of literary genius. Leave a £sign in the comments if you made it to the end. It seems appropriate. I will see you in the next one.